Now let's do the practical of GraphQL. So we will be using the Apollo client and Apollo server to create the GraphQL server and the GraphQL client. For the GraphQL client, we would be using React. We can also use GraphQL client with vanilla JavaScript or plain JavaScript, but we can use React because Apollo client successfully supports React, and due to the popularity of React, we many of the times we will be using Apollo client with React, and that is why Apollo client is many of the time paired with React because of its excellent integration. Now, in the GraphQL practical, we would be creating a GraphQL server. So GraphQL server, and we would be initializing the project for GraphQL server. And then we will be installing npm install the Apollo server and the GraphQL. So we would be installing these two packages in order to have the Apollo server created along with GraphQL. So once the installation is done, we would be jumping into the Visual Studio Code. Now let's create the server.js, and here we will be doing our GraphQL with Apollo integration. So first we would be getting the Apollo server and the GQL from Apollo server. Then we would be defining the GraphQL schema. So we would be defining the type definition and the GQL with the backticks. And here we would be defining the schema like type query. So here we are defining a query that would have a parameter hello, which is a string, and the user that would be taking the ID as input, the basically the ID, and it would be returning the user. We would be defining the type user, which contains an ID, name, and the email. And this exclamation shows that this is a non-nullable field. And we can also define a mutation. So let's define a mutation along with query as well, so that we can create the users as well. So we would be defining a mutation named create user, and that mutation would get these parameters: name, email, and it would be returning the user type once the user has been successfully created. Now let's do the implementation here. So we would be defining, for example, let users is equals to array, and we are creating these two users. Now we have to define the resolvers so that we can resolve these queries using the above data. So for example, we have defined this data as hard coded for now, and we would be resolving the queries and would be returning this data as per the query or the mutation. So we would be resolving the query as well as the mutation using resolvers. So first let's resolve the query, and we have to define hello, which is a, for example, a hard coded string or text, and then we would be defining the user, and there is a method which would be taking a parameter ID and would be returning the user from the users collection. So we are using the find method, and we would be giving the triple equals ID. So we would be returning the relevant user based on the ID. Now we would be defining the mutation as well. Create user, const new user. We would be creating a new user, for example, ID. Now for the ID, we would be, for example, users.length plus 1. And we would be using it in backtick so that it would be resolved. And then we would be using the name and the email. We can simply do like this. So we are creating a new user object. This is a JavaScript object using the parameters like name and email that we would be getting from the client. So we would be then users dot push and new user. We would be pushing this to the new user so that this array would be updated with the new user. And because our mutation says that it would be also returning that user, so we would be returning the user, so return new user. After the resolver has been made, the query, the type definition has been defined, and the users or the queries have been resolved. So we would be creating the server. So the server would be the Apollo server, a new Apollo server with typeDefs is the typedef resolvers. We can also write in a simple way like this so that it would be getting the typedefs and resolvers and it would be listening, and we would be getting the parameter URL, and that parameter would be giving us the URL where the server is listening. We can write like listening at, and this is the URL it would be giving us when the server would be listening. So now let's start it. So we would be using the server.js. So the resolver should be a method. So here we have missed it. So now it is listening at 4000 port. So our server is ready, and now we would be creating the client. So for the client, we would be going back, and here we have created the server. Now let's make the Apollo client. And here we would be using React as I said. So we would be using the npx create React app so that it would install the React app, and we would say it my app. So this would take several minutes or seconds maybe depending on the internet connection, but it would take time. So once it is done, we would be continuing. So once the React create React app is installed successfully, we have to install two other libraries. So we would be going into my app and we would be installing these libraries. So we would be installing the Apollo client and the GraphQL. So now our Apollo client is installed, our GraphQL is installed, and our React application is installed. So we would be removing all the content of the React app index.tsx, and we would be querying our Apollo server. So we would be keeping the React DOM, and we would be importing the Apollo client and its libraries like Apollo client, the in-memory cache so that the server query results would be saved in memory, and we would be using these libraries later. So first we would be creating the object of client. So we would be using the new Apollo client, and in that we would be defining the object like URI, and in the URI we would be defining the URI of the server. Other than this, we would be defining the in-memory cache, the cache as in-memory cache object so that our query results would be cached in memory. Then we would be defining the query. So we would be defining the users query, for example, like get users, the GQL backticks along with the query. So for example, we have the format like query with some query name like for example get user, and we want hello, and we want the user object. We want the user with ID 1. So we want the ID field, sorry, no commas, the name field, and the email field. Now we would be querying, so we would be defining the users that we would be getting from query. So for example, we are defining a method that would be querying to the GraphQL server using get users query. Now we would be using the use query React hook in this case. The use query React hook would be querying the Apollo server and would be giving us the result. So we will be providing the get users to the use query, and we will be getting the data along with the loading status, the error, and data. So in this way, whenever the use query would be executed, it would be giving us the loading, the error information, or the data. So the data is the main thing, but the loading status is also important. If data is being currently loading from the server, so meanwhile we can show the loading status. And if the data is successfully loaded, then we can show the data. So we can write if loading then return loading. So this would return this paragraph loading, and it would render loading. And if there is an error, it would render the error. And this we can make it as a users component so that in this component we would be querying using the get users query, and then it would be printing the user names and the email. So this is the component, and now the component is ready, and here we would be creating another component that would be utilizing the users component in order to show it. So for this, we would be returning from here. First, we will be using the Apollo provider that would be getting the client which we have defined here. So this is the client which we are providing to the Apollo provider, and in that we would be using the users component, and we would be rendering this users component within the Apollo provider so that the use query may understand the GraphQL and the GQL would execute, and we would be rendering this component. So render react dom.render on the document element root. So we have the HTML in which we have the div with ID root on which we want to render our users component. Now let's start. So our React client has been started, and you can see that the users and the hello is available, and this is resolved from the server. Here you can see that on the server it is having Santosh and its email address, and whatever fields that we have queried is being queried with the server. So this is the query and its resolver. So for the hello, it should resolve with the hard coded hello, and for the users, it would be resolved like this. It would be getting from the database or the memory or in memory array. So it would be resolving the user, and the client is querying for the get user along with hello and user, and these fields client wants. Now, if in case the client does not want the email, removing the email from here, and we can see on the result that the email is now not being retrieved from the server. So this way we don't need to create multiple copies of API for the fields or the queries. Just one query and we can get it resolved from the server, and we can change the query as per the fields that we want.